So I want to offer you all a Shabbat Shalom again and my best wishes on this very first Shabbat of the new year. And if your New Year's resolution was to spend more time at shul in 2025, you are doing great so far. Tonight, the beginning of this new year also brings with it a certain ending. The ending of the Torah's dramatic saga of the relationship between Joseph and his brothers, an epic story that winds from Canaan to Egypt and spans decades of its characters' lives. In the portion this week, the story comes to its dramatic climax and resolution when Joseph's brother Judah approaches his brother on bended knee to plead for the life of their youngest brother Benjamin. Judah, who had been the malevolent architect of the brothers' plot to sell Joseph into slavery years earlier, now approaches Joseph with humility and contrition we've never seen in him before. He pleads with Joseph, whom he knows at that point only as a powerful Egyptian official, and begs him to spare Benjamin's life. Something has changed inside Judah over the past few chapters as we've watched him grow. He's become a different man now. He demonstrates sensitivity and kindness and an ability to feel the suffering of others that he's never displayed before. This change in Judah precipitates a change in Joseph as well, and at the end of the portion, Joseph sheds his disguise and reveals himself to his family as their brother who had vanished years earlier. The brothers embrace each other and weep in what is one of the most moving scenes in all of biblical literature. The end of 2024 also delivered some rich material for those of us who are lovers of secular literature also. Over the last couple of weeks, I've received end-of-year lists in my email from at least half a dozen publications ranking the best books of the year. The New York Times had a top 10 list. The New Yorker, not to be outdone, had a top 12. And the overachievers at Time Magazine published a list of the 100 must-read books of 2024, which honestly just made me feel bad. So I spent a few days poring over the list and filling up my Amazon shopping cart because obviously Jeff Bezos' $600 million wedding wasn't going to pay for itself. One of the things, as I did so, that I was delighted to notice about the best books of 2024 was how diverse these lists of nationally recognized stories and authors have become. A generation or two ago, books like these, books from Cuba and Kuwait, Zambia and Nigeria, India and Japan, even if we had access to these stories, they would almost certainly not have appeared on any mainstream lists of the must-read books of the year. As our nation has grown and matured, we've developed increasingly robust cultural appetites, and the kinds of literature and art and music that we consume have broadened and deepened in fruitful and beautiful ways. Especially over the last few years as we've undergone a national reexamination of how race and ethnicity function in America, our cultural and academic institutions have undertaken a wide-ranging examination of the cultural canon to diversify the ways we depict and learn about the world around us. But what's interesting to those of us who love reading books, and those of us who love reading about books, is that even as the lists of great books have diversified, that process has ironically brought along with it new anxieties about diversity in literature. To its credit, the publishing industry has worked energetically to overturn years of, let us say, monochromatic literary culture. But in so doing, it has unwittingly fueled a cultural conversation about whether or not a given author should be entitled to write about characters and subjects from outside their own personal experience. Most often, this scrutiny is focused on authors from conventionally privileged backgrounds who produce content from outside that background, white authors who write black characters, men who write women, and so on. Over the last couple of years, the discourse about who gets to tell which stories has grown more intense, and the consequences for getting it wrong have had serious consequences for authors and for their work. Some great novelists have faced scathing public criticism or had publications canceled because their literary portrayals, especially of minorities, were seen as violations of the current orthodoxy that stories about marginalized communities should only be told by authors who share that cultural identity. A recent opinion piece in an industry publication unironically asks authors, "Who gave you the right to tell my story?" My message tonight is not about cancel culture or about whether or not political correctness undermines great literature. I bring it up tonight because I feel strongly that the idea that a person should only be able to tell a story with which he or she has personal experience is not only a terrible impoverishment of what it means to create great writing, but it also reflects a grave misunderstanding of how we develop a humane, civic sense of empathy. The work of a novelist or a screenwriter is manifestly an exercise of imagination. To consider the experience outside oneself, to conjure the sights and smells of another world, the hurts and desires of another person, and to spend time inhabiting them. That is what the craft of great literature and of all great art has always been built upon. Interestingly, the one group of people who have generally not been hung up on the question of who gets to tell which story are novelists. That's not to say they don't take seriously the ethics of which stories they tell and how they tell them. Novelists today are very careful to do their research, to interrogate the unconscious biases they carry with them, to consider the cultural undertones of their work that may come across as clunky or offensive. Publishing houses now employ sensitivity readers as a matter of course to make sure that plots and characters are free from inaccuracy and caricature. But to suggest that women's stories can ethically only be told by women writers, or Jewish stories only by Jewish writers, belies a deep misunderstanding about how great art and great human beings are built, which most capable writers understand perfectly well. As the great Vietnamese-American novelist Monique Trong wrote recently, "The glory of publishing does not belong to all of us, but the stories do." As a nation, we are suffering mightily from the way we live at a distance from each other, and from our unwillingness to bridge that distance by listening to what others have to say. We're too often incapable of experiencing other people's stories with the same love and sensitivity we have for our own. So when we approach literature like a hostile custody battle, asking what gives you the right to tell my story, we're actively undermining what might otherwise be a powerful remedy that art and literature can offer to our shared culture. Great books, modern and ancient, excite us when they invite us into other places and times we could never visit on our own, but they transform us when they invite us into other people and their unique experiences. And this, at last, is what helps us understand that pivotal moment from the Torah, our own great national work of literature, about the powerful transformation within Joseph's brother Judah. Before that moment of encounter in the Pharaoh's palace, before the revelation of Joseph's true identity, Judah had been spiritually immobilized. He was permanently stuck in his own point of view and his own inability to see the world through others' eyes. The jealousy he felt toward Joseph when he was a young boy grew and curdled into resentment which stayed with him as an adult. His emotional development stunted and unable to grow. It was only after Judah went through his own grief and hardship, the death of his wife, the loss of 2 children, an experience of profound public humiliation at the hands of his daughter-in-law, and the pangs of privation stemming from a widespread famine and drought. Only after those painful experiences could he peel off the narrow lenses through which he had seen the world for all those years and finally find himself able to understand another's suffering. Judah sees Benjamin's fearful panic, and for the first time, he can imagine how bereft his father Jacob will feel if he loses another son. Judah builds a heart of imagination inside himself. He develops a new capacity to imagine another person's feelings that are different from his own, and that newly softened heart becomes a potent internal generator that produces empathy. Judah becomes a different person at the end of his story because he's grown the ability to emotionally inhabit the stories of other people. And it is that exercise of imagination, creativity, and humility that brings about the family's reconciliation and the story's grand resolution. Spiritual empathy and meaningful art both grow from the same root, an appetite to understand the world outside ourselves. We nurture those roots by exploring with curiosity and hunger and patience, reading closely, watching carefully, listening attentively, and not doing those things for the purpose of finding error or fault. That is a sign of love and respect for the world outside ourselves, to cultivate sympathy for another person's motivations and empathy for the things that cause him pain. The good news is that this work comes naturally to us and our spiritual community. We have words and stories in our hearts and veins. We know that the question, "What gave you the right to tell my story?" is the wrong question altogether. The question is, given that our stories have been told and given rise to centuries of cultural richness, what will we do with them now? We have deep muscle memory for the exercise of imagining the other. We have centuries of practice in working to understand our own desires and suffering as a tool for strengthening our ability to detect what other people love, what they fear, and what they yearn for. Our Jewish spiritual directive is a project of ethical imagination, the unending work of striving to love the neighbor as the self. So friends, as we enter this new year together, it's my prayer that this will be, for all of us, a year of great stories, stories told and stories heard. All of us will write chapters this year, and may those chapters bring us and those who encounter us to new heights of spiritual resilience, kindness, and empathy, and may God strengthen us in this work of creativity. Amen.